Hi, this is Neil's on Dynasty. Please like, share, and subscribe. Be kind, helpful, and grateful. And buy some silver and some platinum and some crystallized osmium. It helps you sleep at night. Uh, this report is from, who is it from? It's from these guys here. Chase Carr. 2 hours ago, hundreds of thousands of EVs are rotting away in China. I wasn't going to do this report, but I decided, what the heck. Let people know kind of sort of how we've all been fleeced on the EV car scene. Uh, I've always known it, but when countries are putting billions of dollars in pushing something, you can't tell anybody anything because the government's right. They're pushing it. So, here's the ramifications of not a thought out process on a car industry and why it will most likely fail. And here's the rest of the story. I'll, of course, narrate. I always do. Why the hell not?
History has brought so many interesting phenomena, and the so-called graveyards in China are among the most intriguing ones. Namely, every bigger city in China has at least one of them. A bunch of electric cars left in the field to die slowly. According to some estimations, millions of EVs are rotting away in China, and we've found 5 reasons why this is happening. Number 5.
Okay, first of all, if there are millions, and there are, of electric vehicles rotting away, think of the devastation to the earth and the mining for lithium that was used in the making of those millions of cars that are rotting. And ask yourself, why didn't environmentalists sue?
Car sharing companies that went out of business. When you look at these so-called EV graveyards, no matter in which city of China they're located, they usually have a couple of things in common. For example, all of these electric cars have license plates which indicate they were registered once. Moreover, they're usually painted in the same color and often include no more than a couple of models, which indicates that they were bought by car-sharing companies. That's exactly what happened. Car-sharing companies were the first massive EV customers. Back in the day when EVs were a brand new thing, it was hard to convince people to make such a radical switch. So the government decided to boost the industry growth by giving car-sharing companies massive subsidies for electric cars. Suddenly, EVs became integral parts of their fleets, and if you look at statistics from the early EV days, most of the purchases were done by these companies. Cases of private EV customers were rare. Nevertheless, that made a huge impact on the initial growth of the EV segment. The fast growth was necessary, but it left many casualties. Because once the Chinese government stopped giving massive incentives to car-sharing companies, most of them went out of business. These companies didn't get a chance to renew their fleets, and since we talk about the early stage of electrification, there's no need to explain how all those EVs got outdated in just a few years and now are pretty much unusable. That's where all those EV graveyards come from. Number 4, an organized scheme. No one is clean in this. While authorities use car-sharing companies to boost EV growth, EV startups also took advantage of generous incentives. Because without that massive support, most EV makers wouldn't even start their business. Back in the day, the Chinese government was strongly...
Okay, did you hear that? Most of those EV companies would not have started their companies unless they got free money from the Chinese government. In other words, the Chinese government knew the economics was not there. The supply and demand was not there. None of your basic economic 101 was available. So they created a false supply. And that is now what we're facing, is the diminishing of that false supply, because they didn't have the money to continue to give out to these companies to keep them in business, to bring this false security of the EV industry being solid.
Determined to become a dominant force in the EV segment. It was giving massive support to pretty much every EV company because the criteria was incredibly low. Practically all that those companies needed to fulfill was to meet certain range requirements, which were usually no more than 62 miles. The second more complicated requirement was to sell a certain number of vehicles. Back in the day, there were over 500 EV startups registered in China, so it's pretty clear that it wasn't easy for most of them to find enough customers. It was time for an organized scheme, which once again involved car-sharing companies who became the main customers. But it was clear...
Organized scheme. The EV industry was going to fail several years ago.
That such a state can't last forever. A few years later, once the whole industry got on its feet, the government became less generous with its support. From that moment, it became clear that most of these EV startups would go out of business because their business models weren't sustainable. Not only that, their EVs weren't particularly good either, so all those EVs sold to car sharing companies were barely driven. Quickly enough, they became outdated with uncompetitive range and performance, so the only direction they could head to was the so-called EV graveyards. Number 3. Driving up EV infrastructure. Today, China is not just the largest EV maker in the world, but also by far the biggest EV market, with nearly 9 million electric cars sold just in the last year. Of course, such impressive growth wouldn't be possible without adequate infrastructure. This means that the Chinese government had to figure out how to keep the two aspects of the EV industry growing at the same pace. That was anything but an easy task, because creating a sustainable EV system requires a good charging network. But to build a charging network, you need a certain number of electric cars so charging companies can make money. It's kind of a vicious cycle, so the Chinese authorities had to intervene to get things rolling. This once again brings us to car sharing companies. Those were the first major buyers of electric cars, and the government consciously sacrificed most of them just to boost the process that would make China a global EV powerhouse.
So basically, the Chinese government sacrificed their entrepreneurs so that they could take control of a market that's going to fail in the long run. That is what you guys are calling a world leader, China. They are not.
All those EVs that eventually ended up in graveyards served to drive up the infrastructural development. Chinese authorities sacrificed many car-sharing companies as well as many EV makers, considering that 80% of EV startups already went out of business. Their contribution to the development of Chinese EV infrastructure was huge, and as a result, many Chinese cities nowadays have such a developed infrastructure that taxi companies rely mostly on EVs. Moreover, they don't even charge their EVs because instead of charging stations, they now use battery swapping stations, where a machine plugs out the depleted battery and installs a charged one. Number 2. It's cheaper to buy a new EV than repair it. Here's another reason why EV graveyards are getting bigger. Namely, when it comes to the benefits of electric cars, you can often hear how they're simpler and therefore cheaper to run. Less potential breakdowns along with some typical maintenance actions such as fluid changes made us believe that owning an EV is actually cheaper.
Made us believe. They lied to us.
But reality is different. Even if breakdowns are rare, which we're not sure about, getting an EV fix can be a pretty expensive thing. This particularly refers to the Chinese EV market, where, as we've just mentioned, so many EV companies have gone out of business, so there isn't exactly technical support for eventual repairs. Spare parts, trained technicians, all those things are lacking, so it doesn't surprise that many owners rather choose to replace old EVs with new ones. In most cases, that's actually also a cheaper option, especially if we talk about repairs after collisions, because even a minor collision can damage critical parts such as battery housings, and then repairs can cost a real fortune. What's also interesting is that this isn't just typical for China. The exact same thing is happening in America. We can already see footage that show junkyards full of Tesla models. Most of them are barely damaged, which indicates that owners simply don't want to bother with expensive and time-consuming repairs. Repairs usually cost a fortune, and the lack of trained technicians is one of the main reasons. It's also a reason why EV repairs usually take weeks, if not longer. Altogether, EV repairs are a very painful process. Even insurance houses know that. So instead of wasting their sources on repairs, they rather choose write-offs, even in cases of relatively minor damages. Of course, this causes a kind of chain reaction where insurance premiums on EVs have become significantly higher compared to ICE cars, which only made the gap in terms of running costs even bigger. Number 1. Market oversaturation. Millions of EVs are rotting away in China, and according to the latest reports, it's not just about abandoned, outdated electric cars produced years ago. Even new electric cars are often condemned to rot away because the market is oversaturated. The problem with Chinese EV makers is that they still haven't expanded to Western markets. Even though China is by far the biggest EV maker in the world, it's still forced to sell most of its vehicles on the domestic market. And after the recent moves by Western governments, such as Biden's decision to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, things are about to become even more complicated.
Does it sound like their economy is going to crash on top of all their other problems? Their greatest industry, the electric vehicle market, is fixing to go bankrupt, and the Chinese government has tens and hundreds of billions of dollars invested in that. Bye bye China and BRICS.
Even the biggest players, such as BYD, struggle to expand to abroad markets. 95% of its sales are still reserved for Chinese customers, and the problem is that even such a huge market as China has its limitations. The market size is currently at around 9 million EVs annually, and with the recent slowdown, things probably won't change drastically in the following years, which is a bit of a problem, because relying mainly on the domestic market means production way under full capacity for most automakers. According to He Xiaopeng, XPeng CEO, Chinese EV makers have the capacity to produce over 20 million vehicles a year, which significantly exceeds the aforementioned sales numbers. With this in mind and the potential slowdown of EV growth, it's no surprise that EVs are piling on dealer lots. That's actually a global phenomenon because this same exact thing is happening in the US, where Tesla is using old mall parking lots to store all of its unsold EVs. What shouldn't be overlooked either is the environmental impact of all these abandoned electric cars. As you probably know, EVs are significantly more emissions intensive to build, so the only way to become more environmentally friendly than gas-powered counterparts is to make hundreds of thousands of miles, which is obviously not going to happen. And that is just part of the environmental problem. The other one is that, along with the rise of EV popularity, the thing that has also risen is demand for electricity, which happens at the time when China is trying to cut coal consumption at its power plants. It is an uphill battle, and with the way things are developing at the moment, we don't see how China could solve the.
Yeah, China's not going to be able to solve any of their problems. Because in the middle of all these economic problems they're having, they want to go to war with the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and America, and India. Wow, they want to go to war with everyone. Their infrastructure's collapsing. Their business, their false business that they propped up, has just been crushed by America and 100% tariff on the EV cars. So, how great is China? Hey, hold on a second. Let's talk about GDP. When they get caught lying on their numbers that give BRICS all this great GDP, you're going to find out it was a lie. They didn't have all that GDP, because now you have South Africa, one of the top 5 BRICS members, that has power for 12 hours out of the 24-hour day. Pretty much they're out of business. They're going bankrupt. Now you have China fixing to be in the same issue as South Korea, 2 of the 3 main players of the BRICS. And then you have India. And then for all you people that think that BRICS is going to come up with a hard currency that you can stick in your wallet, you're misinformed, and you need to get off LSD, because India is fixing to break away and become a reserve currency on their own, separate from BRICS. So why would India want 2 paper currencies? They don't. So all BRICS will ever be is a SWIFT system controlled by those countries that are in BRICS, for the ones that actually survive their economic downturns, for which China and South Africa ain't looking too good for. Reason why I haven't done any reports on Brazil, which is another big member of BRICS, one of the top 5, is because they're actually having a civil war as we speak. So I'm going to see how that plays out. Civil unrest, not civil war. They're having real bad civil unrest. So their government's changing as well. And oh, by the way, I think next year the president of Brazil is going to be president of the G20. You guys have a nice night.